Continuing to talk about the science reasoning test on that ACT, let's talk about some strategies. In lots of ways, not in every single way, but in lots of ways, the science reasoning test is a lot like the reading test. You need to answer the questions based almost solely on what is in the passage itself, especially for the data. I have seen a couple of data questions that did require prior knowledge, but it wasn't anything more than just basic prior knowledge. Now, some of the research questions did take a little bit more prior knowledge, and they're a little more time consuming, just like we talked about in the last video, because you have to compare two things or see what changed from one experiment to the other, things like that. I do want to finish up talking about the conflicting viewpoints. It is the most time consuming question. It is the one that I want you to do last because it's kind of the most difficult questions. There are a lot of connections that need to be made. A lot of big picture questions show up in this passage. And if we're going to miss any of those 40 questions, these 7 are at the top of the list. So that's why I want you to save it for last, because we're not as likely to get them right anyway, even if we had all the time in the world. So since those are the ones that are going to cost us most time and the ones we're more likely to get incorrect, those are the ones that I want you to do last. And I just wanted to finish up from the last video to make sure that I was clear on that. And I've talked about this a little bit before. Don't be afraid of the science jargon. This subject test is pretty straightforward. The language can be off-putting, especially if science is not your forte, but don't let it confuse you. Just, again, read it as if it were a name in a novel that you didn't know how to pronounce, but follow along with what the passage says about it. Get past the language. And the questions are fairly straightforward and pretty simple to answer. It's much more about time management on this test than anything else. So my philosophy on this is to read the questions first. There's really not, for 6 out of the 7 passages, there's not a whole lot of language on this test. It's much more about comparing graphs and tables and experiments and things like that. So I would just go straight to the questions and then try to look at the data that's given there and see if you can answer it based on the data that's given. If you need to read a little bit, to kind of get your bearings on what it's talking about, then you can do that. But do it after you've read the questions. So my philosophy is to read the questions first. Many of them you can answer without doing any reading at all. So for data representation and research, look at the charts and the graphs to answer the questions. And here's the beauty part, is on most of the exams that I have seen, they tell you exactly which chart, which graph, which table to go to. It'll say in figure 1, la 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 la, whatever. Or in table 2, yada, yada, yada. So it pretty much points you in the question where in the passage to go to. Now, I will say on the December test, the December 2012 test, which is the practice exam that I'm going to have you start with. It's not a practice exam, it's the actual test that was given in December of 2012. That's where I want you to start. It's the link that I'm going to give you to practice on the science test. And I will say that some of that wasn't happening on some of those questions. They didn't tell you where to go in the passage. And that was kind of new. That's a change, a trend that I'm seeing from that. If you labor excruciatingly over every little sentence, every little word, every little piece of data, then you're eating up time like crazy, and that's really not how to tackle this test. Tackle this test by reading the question, go to the figure of the table that it refers you to, go to the part of the passage or the information that's given that they're referring to, and find the information or the connection so that you can answer the question, and then move on. Make a decision about each question, answer it, and then move on. Don't save the question and return to it later. Answer it before you leave it. Don't leave anything blank. Don't leave any question blank. Okay, just give an answer and move on. You don't have time to come back and rework any parts of this test. That may be a good strategy for maybe the reading test or maybe even the math test. It's not a good strategy on this test. If you can't readily find the answer to the question, fill in the blank and move on. The most reliable method for choosing the correct answer is to kind of play a matching game. Before you look at any of the answers that are given, try to answer the question first in your own words. Try to find the answer in the passage itself before you look at the answer choices. Read the question, go to the passage, try to find the answer, and then go back and see if your answer matches any of the answer choices. This way you're not influenced by the incorrect answer choices that might tempt you based on your prior knowledge, based on your personal knowledge, those kinds of things. You're not tempted to get the incorrect answer. You've actually looked in the passage to get the correct answer. So once you come up with your answer, look at the answer provided by the people who wrote the test and pick the one that best matches your answer. All right, so base your answers on the passage. That's big. There are some prior science knowledge, but usually it has to do with definitions of terms. You need to know, I remember one had something to do with osmosis, and if you didn't understand osmosis, you really weren't going to be able to answer that question. That's another trend that I'm seeing is in the past where there might have been 2 out of the 40 questions that required some basic prior knowledge. I think on the last test that I saw, there were 6 out of the 40 questions that required prior science knowledge. So that's a trend that I'm seeing. So make sure you know your basics, okay? But only answer the questions based on the content that's given to you in the passage, okay? In the case of the science reasoning test, external knowledge does have a potential to hurt you. All the information that you need to know is in the passage. There are no trick questions other than knowing some basic definitions of science terms, and I mean very basic stuff. You don't have to have a lot of science knowledge to work your way through this test. Okay, there is a new trend where more questions involve some science content, than I've seen on past tests. So just make sure you know your basics. Make sure you know your basic biology, chemistry, and physical science, and you'll be fine. So remember, there are 3 types. You want to do data first, research second, and save the dueling scientists for last. You're going to identify them by 5 questions, 6 questions, and 7 questions. So just remember the 5, 6, 7 rule. All right, so the big thing that I would tell you on the data is identify them first, do them first, and it will buy you time for the research summaries, okay? And it's going to look something like this. There are 5 questions. There's one thing basically to look at. There's not a lot of comparing between different tables and different graphs. Usually you just have to look for information within a graph and talk about what's going on at one single point in that graph. So the data stuff is fairly straightforward. On the research summaries, do those second. Those are the ones that have 6 questions. They're going to be comparing things. They're going to eat up a little bit more of your time. Don't rush through these, but don't spend an inordinate amount of time on any particular single question. These are going to be, in experiment 2, this happened. Compare that with, what happened in experiment 3 and what was the change from table 1 to table 2, or what happened with this seed, compared with that seed. So these are going to ask you to compare different things, so they're a little more time intensive. This is the bulk of your science reasoning test. You want to get through the data as quickly and as correctly as you can to buy yourself all the time that you can for the research passages, and there are 3 of those. It is the bulk of the test, so make sure that you stay focused and answer the question that's given. So here, here's study 1 and figure 1 and study 2 and figure 2 and all those kinds of things. And there are 6 questions attached to this. And so you want to make sure that you're answering those comparisons and you see what changed from figure 2 to figure 3, and so on. All right, the dueling scientist or conflicting viewpoints. This needs to be the last one that you do. You're sacrificing your time on this one. You're going to rush through this one because this one is most likely to cost you points. This is one of the most difficult ones to actually answer because it's based on so many big picture questions, and it's based on making so many connections with the material that's given there, especially if you are not a fast reader so that you can read through this section quickly. These 7 questions are probably going to cost you more points than all the rest of them put together. So you're sacrificing this one, in effect, throwing this one under the bus so that you can give the majority of your energy and your brain power to the first 83% of the test that you've done. I really think this is a big secret to being more successful on the science test because it is just a lot of language to work through. All right, and you identify this one again by counting that there are 7 questions. So the biggest secret to improving an already fairly good ACT score is practice test. And it's not just taking them and seeing what your score was. The best thing that you can do with practice test is to look individually at each separate question and identify what went wrong. Okay, so take a practice test and identify every question you got wrong. Figure out, more importantly, here's the secret to success. Figure out why you got it wrong. Was it a time management issue? Was it speed? Was it misreading? Was it not knowing the content? And then teach yourself what you should have done to get that particular question right. If you can't figure out what you did wrong, find someone who can. Okay, that's what I'm for. If you can't figure out what you did wrong on one particular question, then contact me and we'll talk about it. If it's content, I'll teach you the content. If it's speed, we'll talk about things you can do, to increase your speed, those kinds of things. But the biggest key to taking practice test is what you do after. And it's not just seeing what your grade was and, oh, well, it's a 24 this time or it was a 26 last time. You're not using practice exams to their full benefit when you do that. The whole point to taking a practice exam is to see specifically where you went wrong and fix those specific problems. That is the power in ordering the December and the April test. When you get those tests in, that's actually how you performed under a testing situation. Look for what you did wrong and find strategies to fix that. Now, when you're taking your practice exams, the best thing that you can do is take them under actual conditions. Make everybody leave you alone, shut yourself in a room, make sure you have a timer there, and don't cheat. If it's 35 minutes, then you only take 35 minutes and you work through it as quickly as you can. If no calculator is allowed, don't use a calculator. Make yourself or put yourself in the context of the actual ACT so that your results are consistent and true. Okay? The more closely your attitude and strategies during the practice test reflect those that you'll employ during the actual test, the more predictive the practice test will actually be. All right, so score your practice test, but it's most important that you understand what you did wrong. Look at each question. You shouldn't just look to see what the correct answer is, also why you got it wrong, and fix those problems. If you learn precisely what your mistake was, you're much less likely to make that mistake again. All right, so there's no penalty for wrong answers, so bubble in everything. If you are an auditory learner, you're going to have to talk to yourself during the exam. You can whisper, but auditory learners do not get information unless it passes through their ears, just like visual learners don't get anything unless it passes through their eyes. So identify what kind of learner that you are. Here's the Spark Notes for the math and science prep, so you can look up that. I'm rushing because I'm near the end here. So if you're ready for a practice test, I have attached the December 2012 Science Reasoning ACT test. So take that as a practice, and then email me when you're done, and I will email you back the key to that so you can actually identify what you need to work on.